So I'm a big proponent of truth and reconciliation with Canada's Indigenous population. And the Trudeau government has made central that truth and reconciliation, their truth and reconciliation program, is at the forefront of their desires. However, I am a big detractor from Canada's truth and reconciliation program for two reasons. One, it's devoid of a lot of truth, and two, it makes no legitimate attempt at reconciliation. Other than that, it's great, but that's kind of everything. So it's kind of funny because this video is going to be about why truth and reconciliation is important and why colonialism is bad and how that should be centered to the conservative movement, because it's really our idea. So the reason I'm making this is because on the UN's new agenda, the new thing they're trying to push is UNDRIP. It's called UN Declaration on Rights of Indigenous Peoples. It's the UN governing how people would treat their Indigenous people. It's basically just Canada, America, and any right-wing government in the Western Hemisphere. It has nothing to do with, China or Russia or any of those, or it doesn't care about the Yazidis in Iraq and Syria. No. But this is the biggest threat to, people would say Canada. Yes, it's a huge threat to Canada, but it's a even bigger threat to the Indigenous people in Canada. This is in fact, is like super-colonialism. Okay, so why is colonialism bad? Let's start there. One of the reasons it's bad, and this is a very big libertarian moment, right? Or idea. No taxation without representation, right? That's the founding of the Americans, right? You don't want to be governed, right, as a colonial entity. You don't want the government to be so far removed from you, because then they don't make decisions. Because if you don't have impact on the government, right, they don't make decisions that are on the best behalf of the people there. So putting the Indigenous people's rights and treatments into the hands of not only the federal government, which at least has some responsibility to them, that's the other thing, to do a whole nother level and say, oh yes, the UN will take care of the Indigenous people. Yes, because the Indigenous people have had such a lucky time with organizations, associated with corruption, pedophilia, and money laundering. Okay, so one, colonialism is bad because we're conservative, libertarian, smaller government. We don't give super global governments, right? They never work, and they would never. If you think the UN has the best interests of the Cree and the Ojibwe and the Métis, you're crazy. You are a crazy person. Now, I will say truth is very important in the way we deal with Indigenous, because we have to know the history. And I've said before in other things that a lot of the solutions to Canada's problems, and a lot of the even the rhetoric that the left wing of Canada wants to push, a lot of that can be found in Canadian history. You want to look to reconciliation and defeating myths of the savage Indian or native, whatever you want to call it, right? Look at Tecumseh. Look at Tecumseh and Brock. I mean, remember when we beat the Americans in the War of 1812? I mean, they say they win, we say we win. The British say they win. Honestly, the natives lose, but still, right? The how they captured Detroit. This is a great story, right? Tecumseh basically comes up with the idea saying these people think we're all crazy. So what you're going to do is I'm going to put all the women and children in canoes, and we're going to circle around Detroit, and then I'm going to have all the men, and we're just going to look crazy and like wide-eyed. We're not going to blink very much. And then you go to the Americans, pretend to be scared of us, and say, listen, if you give us the city, I promise I'll stop them. But if you don't give me the city, I don't know what all these crazy natives will do. And they went that, and they fooled the Americans, and that's how they took Detroit, by just tricking them out of it. So, right, this is a great story because it implies, right, that clearly they weren't savages, but they knew that they knew how they were being perceived. These people were clearly capable of politics. So another thing I hate when we learn about this, is the natives didn't understand land ownership. They didn't understand, like, what's more like condescending and racist than that? It drives me up a wall whenever that argument comes up. They didn't understand. They were looking to the sky and they knew the value of the trees and the spirits, but they couldn't understand. Look at a friggin' Iroquois fort. They didn't understand land. Okay, Ontario and Quebec are two provinces now. That's basically the battle line of the Algonquin and the Iroquois when the French first came. Right? Look at an Iroquois fort and look at an Iroquois village and how it's set up, and tell me those people don't understand the concept of owning land or private land ownership or agricultural development. Like, please try and make that argument. Okay? Look at the Mi'kmaq. I use the example of the Mi'kmaq all the time. The Mi'kmaq are the greatest example of how they clearly understood politics. Okay? The Mi'kmaqs would always side with the losers. And like, you think that's weird, but the Mi'kmaqs totally understood that they get better deals when the French and the English are fighting each other, right? So they would always try and maintain that balance. If the French were getting too much on upper hand, a lot of Mi'kmaq tribes would switch to the English to keep them balanced, because they knew they would get better deals when the English needed them. Like, these people had been fighting and trading and living together for thousands of years. Like, they didn't understand, and they were just these magical like, so devoid of truth, And I get the impulse to do this, because, you know, in the 1960s, I remember reading Malcolm X's biography, and he said, like, Black history was basically one paragraph. They were slaves, now they're not, and the teacher laughed it off. And to an extent, that's what Native history was in Canada for a long time, right? We had the 60s scoop, it went on, right? So I get that there was the portrayal of the wild savage. However, to swap the caricature of the wild savage and then substitute it with the noble savage it's not progress, and it's not the truth. It's just not the truth. It's just not the truth. So a lot of this is devoid of truth. Now, to say that there was nothing bad ever done to the Indigenous, no, that's ridiculous. That's ridiculous. Residential schools existed, you know, the betrayal of Sitting Bull, that happened. But remember, there was friendship at one point, right? Our greatest soldier in the First World War was, the best sniper was Indigenous. There were Indigenous people that always contributed to the history of Canada. We go back to the War of 1812. The only reason Canada is a country is because of the Pan-Indian alliance that Tecumseh made, and then came and fought with Canada, right? So there was a brotherhood, right, in the early 1800s between the Indigenous forces. Now, the story of Canada and the Indigenous isn't, and I said this, isn't this like, you know, evil, malicious tragedy they got off the, you know, I mean, I said, no, it's a tragedy. It's not a sort of horror show, is what I say. And I'm not saying it's not, parts of it aren't horrific, but what I'm saying is, it is a emotional tragedy of a betrayed brotherhood, right? The people who fought for us, when it became convenient, we ignored them, turned against them, and then tried to civilize them in a way that wasn't so civil, right? This is the truth. And this type of truth, if we understand it, and we understand, like I've always been saying, if people understood the real history of Canada and the Indigenous coming through, it's a great metaphor, and it's a great learning lesson for everything that is, or most things that are actually wrong in Canada right now. It would be great if we actually learn this history, right? And we just want to focus on, you know, if you just want to say Indigenous history is purely residential schools and it was, you know, just sexual abuse. Like, I'm not denying that happened, but you can't just, I mean, it's like, I'm Jewish. You can't, the whole history of the Jewish people isn't the Holocaust. That's not our whole history. If we just only focus on that, you never grow. It's not true. You miss all the good. You miss that. And, you know, I mean, yes, people will make the argument that, yes, it wasn't every residential school. Yes, not every person in every residential school is evil, but I think we can all agree, on aggregate, it was pretty terrible, and there was widespread sexual and physical abuse. So, I mean, we're not going to ignore that. Of course, talk about that. Don't make it seem like, oh, it wasn't that bad. That's not what I'm saying. But when you don't tell the real truth, when you just try and pretend it was this absolute horror show where Samuel de Champlain got off the boat and said, babies, eat all the babies, blah, 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 like that, it's not the truth. And without truth, you're not going to get reconciliation, which is the second part of this. How do we reconcile with the Indigenous? Okay, what do we do? Screw them over? Broke some deals? You know, consign them to poverty in the residential system, which is the stupidest system ever. Like, if you want to create a historically and chronically impoverished and corrupt society, make the residential system, the reserve system, right? There is no better way to make sure that a people will never succeed than to force them into the reserve system, this sort of quasi double government socialist system where they can't even own private land. It's so insane. Now, not saying they can't have land, but I'm saying the way this, can we at least agree the way the system is broken? Can we at least agree with that? Like, yes, we don't want to take their land away, but the fact that they don't individually own the land, the fact that the land will be owned by councils, the fact that sort of there's no government oversight of some of these councils, and then you have crazy government regulations on them, it creates one, like, sort of no government accountability, but also then, like, incredibly overly bureaucratic government intervention. It's like the worst of every world. It's the most insane, illogical system ever designed. But okay, we want to reconcile. How do we do this, right? How about we try and get them out of poverty, right? So I've heard a lot of Indigenous chiefs talk about eco-colonialism, right? You have these left-winger eco-colonialists, and a lot of them is like, you see over the barrel, like a lot of it is like Rockefeller funded. It's funded by American oil companies who pay, you know, Indigenous protesters when they're convenient, right, to protest whatever Canadian energy so they don't have to compete with the market, so they have to buy American oil, right? And then once they get these projects shut down, well, then all the money drives out, and then these communities are even left even more impoverished, right? How about economic reconciliation? How about we have trans-Canada infrastructure, and then we make deals with the indigenous tribes that they can work, and when we're on their land, they have rights to it, right? They can have some sort of ownership of something, right? And then make money off of that. How about that? How about instead of creating a system that is so incredibly stupid that forces them to it forces like 90%, it basically punishes 90% of them to poverty. And it's not because, oh, the indigenous people, they're genetically whatever inferior with this. It's like, no, if you create a system that incentivizes economic failure and political corruption, you will get economic failure and political corruption, because that's where all the incentives are set. And we can't even say this. It's crazy. It drives me absolutely nuts. I mean, if I was on a reserve system, I would be ranting all day instead of like half the day. It's absolutely insane. So I bring this up because if we don't move forward and actually try and get some truth, right? Because I guarantee you, if we tell the truth about what happened between us, both good and bad, with the native population, I guarantee you it will diffuse a lot of the tension. And then if you diffuse a lot of the tension and you give them the ability to make some money, not be poor, right, you will get reconciliation. And there you go. And then we don't need the UN. Then Trudeau will try and involve the UN again, but we don't need it, and we should destroy it. Destroy the UN. Destroy the UN. You know what? We should join forces with the indigenous tribes and then burn down the UN like the good old days in the War of 1812 when we burned down that White House. Yeah. Oh, disclaimer to the YouTube gods. No, don't burn down the United Nations. But you should pick it up and move it into North Korea and then throw all the diplomats into North Korea because that's what they deserve. And damn you, UN. Grrr. Okay. See you tomorrow.